question. Am I a genius? The answer I like to give is yes, but the true answer, unfortunately, is no. I'm a normal musician. I have normal talent comparable to other musicians. So, what makes a musician capable of improvisation? So, a new student arrives and I show her a few things and demonstrate improvisation in different styles and genres, and it usually goes like this. Oh, you like Dua Lipa? I do like her too. Well, do you wonder how Don't Start Now would sound if Mozart had written it? And then I start improvising it in a Mozart style, so to say. So the most common reaction to that is like complete wow effect. And after this wow effect, there's usually this sort of, oh my god, you are such a genius, and so on. And after that, student goes home, tells her parents or friends, oh my god, my teacher is such a genius. You give him a note or you play him a song once and he improvises on it in different styles and so on. Here's the myth to dispel. It's necessary to understand that improvising a piece doesn't mean creating something entirely new, or at least not exactly. Think of it like telling a story. If I want to tell a story, maybe to my young child, and I don't know what story to tell, I make one up. I invent a main character, perhaps a secondary character, definitely an antagonist, a setting, some form of adversity to overcome. And this way I create a narrative dynamic. When I imagine a story, I don't have to invent the very definition of a character or the very definition of an antagonist. I know what a character is, I know what an antagonist is. And why do I know that? Because I know many stories. I've read books, I've watched movies, I played video games, I know what it means to create a story. It doesn't have to be the greatest story in the world, but virtually all of us can create a simple story. It's the same for music. Creating a musical story, in other words, improvising a 1-minute piece, doesn't really require starting from scratch with notes, with chords, with sequences, rhythms. The musician already knows all these elements because they have them in their toolbox. It's just a matter of deciding, yes, this without preparation, which items to take from the toolbox and how to use them. And that usually comes after years of practice. It becomes sort of an automatic response of the fingers after a while. But the items are already there. So the natural question that arises is, if improvisation is such a natural part of human expression and we use it so regularly in our daily lives, why has this practice seemingly been completely abandoned in classical music? And to answer this question, we first need to understand when improvisation in music began. Music is born from improvisation. I know imagining this might sound strange considering the world in which we live, our current situation, and the fact that we've grown up in an era where music has been fully written down for centuries. But the reality is that music was never written down in history until a very specific point. Or better yet, let's say that first manuscript that attests to music and the intonation of notes related to music dates back to 1400 BC, the so-called Hymn of Nikal. The tablet represents fragmented instructions for performing music. It suggests that the music was composed using harmonies of thirds and was written using a diatonic scale. There's also another tablet from around 1250 BC that shows a more advanced form of notation. And while debates still exist about interpreting the notation system, it's clear that the notation indicates the names of the strings of a type of harp, and the intonation of the strings is described also in other tablets. There's also a tradition of written music in ancient Greece, at least until the 6th century before Christ, and onwards during the Byzantine Empire and into the medieval era. Okay, but why writing music then? The very idea of writing music, just like the idea of actually writing anything, arose from the need to preserve what was previously performed autonomously and transmitted orally. It needed to be inscribed on stone or paper, whatever, to be conserved for a long time and potentially forever. This makes us understand that the use of notation, that is written music, right, is nothing but an attempt to solve the historical problem of unwritten music, meaning it disappears after being performed. And it's not just the music that vanishes, but also the tuning systems, the performance techniques, the musical theory about chords, accompaniment, octave divisions, scales, whatever. Essentially everything necessary for a musician in order to perform. That's why we started writing not only theory manuals and research papers about music theory, but also the music itself. In this sense, writing music is nothing but an attempt to freeze in time an idea that was once only improvised. In other words, all music, even the written kind, is born from improvisation. Why did we stop improvising music at concerts? Well, how much time do you have? It's a long story, and let's say everything starts from a historical shift. And what is the role of the artist in the modern era, and what's the very definition of art? We can say with a certain assurance that starting from the Romantic period, which is around 1800, the push towards extreme virtuosity, embodied by figures like Franz Liszt on the piano, for example, led over time to a priority for performers to focus on a technical acrobatics taken to the extreme. It's quite evident that such a level of technical and virtuosic complexity can't be improvised, simply because it's too difficult, it's too intricate. And what happened then was a growing emphasis on the effect that music should produce, the astonishment it should evoke, and the notion that it should somehow demonstrate surpassing the limits of human capability. The pursuit of perfection. Perfection and amazement, but that's not all. During the 20th century, the emergence of recording systems and ethnomusicology allowed historians to create what is arguably the most extensive catalog in human history concerning music. For us, it's absolutely commonplace nowadays, but there hasn't been any other historical period where one could read, listen to, or see remotely comparable amount of music as accessible as we have today. While this led to a significant movement concerning, for example, historically informed performance, it definitely inhibited improvisation even more. The concept of right notes and wrong notes, the whole idea of interpreting a piece, all depends on the relationship between what we believe was the correct execution of a piece and the standard we aspire to today in order to recreate that historical practice. This ties into another concept, that is copyright. Oddly enough, copyright didn't exist in human history until the early 800s. And the idea that a work must be preserved, attributed to an author, and that by law it cannot be modified or altered in any way is a very recent idea in human history. In the past, the cases of what we would now call plagiarism are countless. Not only music, but even in literature, for example. Let me tell you a story. A few years ago, wanted to perform this very famous contemporary composer, and I won't mention the name. I aimed to create a project in which this composer's work will be reinterpreted by a different ensemble, meaning arranged. I was even willing to purchase any existing arrangements if I wasn't given the chance to compose them myself, but too bad there were none. So needless to say, after months of negotiation with the publishing house, emails, endless timelines and all this stuff, I was literally forbidden not only from recording this composer's music, again, very famous one, but even from performing it due to copyright protection. And by the way, it was a no-profit project, just saying. Now, I'm not the brightest mind of this century, that's for sure, but I know that contemporary classical composers are a niche of a niche of a niche in the music industry. So we're talking about people whose sales volumes are probably comparable to, I don't know, a local boy band. I also believe that any contemporary composer, particularly because of what just mentioned, will be more than delighted for their music to receive this kind of recognition, and for young musicians to be willing to sacrifice their time and their money to perform and to spread their music worldwide. But I personally would. Isn't it strange? In my case, that composer had recently passed away. So all the decision-making process rested with the publishing house, which theoretically should relay this request to the heirs. But I'm not sure if and how often this actually happened in practice. I have no clue. I don't want. In the past, the authors were plagiarized, so to say, as a form of homage, so to recognize the merit of an idea. And inevitably, a law that literally prevents me from performing another composer's music or forces me to pay a toll for it, or a law that could heavily fine me if a song I wrote happens to be too similar to someone else's before me, that doesn't really contribute a lot to the atmosphere of freedom in which also free improvisation thrives. But could you tell me, yes, of course, Luca, but there are also genres like jazz and pop where improvisation is common. Yes, of course, more so for jazz than pop for sure, but yeah, let's not forget that it's not jazz and pop representing the exception here, but rather the rule. So literally all genres, all musical styles currently in use today, and also those from the past, oh, by the way, including classical music of the past, involve a considerable element of improvisation. It's only classical music, or what we now refer to as classical music, that's entirely written down and allows no room for improvisation. And I have a little story here for you. So I was rehearsing, right, with this ensemble, and we were searching for new repertoire to include in a concert. We started thinking about what kind of music, what kind of composers, and so on, and the idea of trying some new music came up. I can't actually remember the composer right now. We found a couple of songs, so to say, we liked, but unfortunately they were for voice and piano, while in our group we had more instruments, right? So my initial instinct as an artist was to arrange a couple of these songs for our ensemble, and surprisingly, this sparked some kind of astonishment and almost indignation from a member of the ensemble who also somewhat reproached me with words like, "You can't arrange a composer," almost if I had touched something sacred. And mind you, this person, this musician, is a truly talented, amazingly talented and open-minded even, completely capable of playing professionally worldwide. So I don't bring up this example to illustrate the close-mindedness among musicians, make no mistake. It is an example to show how musical education within the classical realm lets musicians to believe that music is a close, untouchable phenomenon, and that a musical work is something sacred, deserving the, utmost respect from the distance. Between the lines, also, arranging a classical piece will imply disrespecting the composer, according to this mindset. Oddly enough, if the same situation occurred in a jazz group or, in a pop band, nobody would even raise the question, right? Arranging a jazz standard or a pop song is a common practice, and it's also a vital part of a musician's craft. So why should classical music be any different? The somewhat elitist idea that classical composers, by definition, should be more deserving of respect compared to, the Beatles or John Coltrane or Billie Eilish, it's just ridiculous. Yeah, and now you could tell me, Luca, yes, you're right, but this really doesn't change the situation. In today's world, I really love to attend a concert and watch the pianist improvise music over, a Beethoven sonata, or maybe create some Bach-style chorale on a Taylor Swift song. You see, I've been deeply involved in improvisation in recent years especially, and I actually noticed a growing interest in improvised music, especially since I began my conservatory studies. It was like 15 years ago. It was very different back then. And I am even touring with a piano solo recital called IMPROVISES, where I do exactly what I said, also involving the audience, which I think it's actually super important. By the way, if you're interested, check the link in the description if you're there. Okay, commercial break, over. More and more musicians are rediscovering their interest in improvisation. I believe the main reason is not only that the internet gives us access to a wealth of knowledge we probably didn't know existed before, but also because musicians have realized that traditional channels for developing their professional careers are no really longer enough or even work. Gone are the days where you could just win a few competitions and then you had a more or less secure and guaranteed career as a pianist. Today you can win a major piano competition and still struggle to work as a full-time pianist to secure enough concerts or to earn a sufficient income. I think I read somewhere, don't take this as a gospel, but less than 20% of pianists participating in international piano competitions can actually sustain themselves as full-time pianists, meaning without teaching or doing other jobs. While this may sound disheartening for young musicians entering the conservatory world, I think on the flip side it's actually fascinating for the new generations to understand that the world doesn't end with like Chopin's first ballad, and there's much more to explore, much more music to play, to improvise, to compose, to experiment with, that we've been led to believe through the mainstream channels. I've been personally involved in improvisation for many years now, both as a teacher and as a pianist, and I'm really convinced that things will change in the coming years, and I personally believe for the better, or at least I hope so. And I just got a message that I have to leave, so that's a wrap for today. Thanks for tuning in. If you like my work and want to see more of it, please insert YouTube random CTA here, and also check the link in the description for my upcoming Improvisations piano recital, but only if you're interested, please. No spam, I promise. Catch up soon. Bye for now.